Welcome back to another episode of BReal Talks. I'm Sophia Givry. Today we are joined with Dr. Robin Nussbaum. Robin identifies as a white, queer, pronoun-switching, genderqueer woman. She is currently the Associate VP for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Learning at the Girl Scouts of Western Washington. Prior to that, Robin was the Senior Inclusion and Equity Specialist at the Washington State Bar Association for over 6 years and led the Gender and Sexuality Resource Center at SUNY Oneonta for over 5 years. Robin earned their PhD in social psychology. They focus on bias, stigma, and discrimination and influence and persuasion. A longtime social justice advocate, she was a youth leader with the Seattle Young People's Project, has staffed the LGBT Center at several universities, and most recently was the VP for Diversity and Inclusion for the Puget Sound Association of Legal Administrators. Robin has also served as a professor at several universities, including her alma mater, Vassar College. Robin brings over 2 decades of social justice, equity advocacy, training facilitation experience, and leadership development to their work. Today, we're going to be talking about advocacy around gender identity and sexuality, and just Robin's general experience in the workplace. Thank you so much for joining us, Robin.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So you have done a lot of work that relates to social justice. How has your personal experience and identity shaped your career path?
Yeah, well, I want to start off acknowledging that, I have been very fortunate, and much of that fortune or luck has been based really not so much on luck, but on, the fact that I'm white and the privileges that I carry in terms of race and class, and probably a few other things as well. So I just kind of want to acknowledge that, because I do feel like my experience is probably different from others who don't have some of these same privileges. And, I think that just is so important to acknowledge. But to answer your question more directly, coming out was a pretty, it wasn't super, super hard for me. I was a little scary for a little bit, but it was not super hard for me. I knew my parents were basically going to be accepting. And I raised that just because coming out is what sort of started me on the path of social justice work. So I feel like I got kind of interested in LGBT activism, but then when I started working with that group you mentioned, the Seattle Young People's Project, they had several initiatives going on, including at the time we were calling it something like multicultural education, which you don't hear quite as much anymore, but was the phrase then. And we are talking 20 plus years ago, 25 years ago, probably. I just sort of pretty immediately started in on that and then didn't really stop. And how much it was focused on LGBT issues versus kind of broader social justice or anti-racism work has changed over the years. In college, it was very LGBT focused. And in fact, I think I made a lot of sort of racist mistakes in that time, not really recognizing or seeing reality. And then later I worked for an organization called the American Friends Service Committee, and had someone who I still think of as a mentor and guide, who worked for that same organization, who really had an excellent intersectional lens and just allowed me and helped me grow and see how connected everything really was. And so my career path really kind of started with coming out and then grew into this broader focus on anti-oppression work in general. So that's sort of how my identity, and I should have said, by the way, when I was coming out, at that point, I think I came out as bi, I think. I can't even remember for sure. Now the word I choose to use for myself is queer. And then also that was in high school. And then somewhere around college, I think I started identifying as genderqueer as well. So I'll just add those identities for clarity.
Yeah, I think all of that context really, for me anyway, explains a lot of your career track, right? And you adding those transitions and then that focus on intersectionality, it shows the growth that you made throughout your career. And kind of looking at some of the challenges that you faced, have you ever experienced prejudice or discrimination? And how did you really go about kind of navigating that?
Yeah, I do think that I have experienced a few times where particularly more my gender identity, I think, than my sexual orientation had some impacts. I have felt some discrimination and a sense sometimes of people not valuing my input or seeing me as a credible person because of that. I think there was lots of confusion about what gender identity was. Even now there still is, but I think and back then, even in sort of more queer spaces, there was a confusion about gender identity, I think, to some degree. And so I do think I experienced some, and definitely some times where I either chose not to be particularly out about that aspect of my identity, or if I was, where I did feel like, but it was much more on that realm of kind of microaggressions, or just I don't even want to say aggressions, but like me not being able to figure out if something was happening because of my gender identity or sexual orientation, or because, I wasn't good at that work, or I don't know, that's not exactly it, but that thing where you can't quite figure out what's happening and why. And I will say there are times when I kind of ignored it or felt powerless to do anything about it, and so felt like there wasn't much to do about it. I think sometimes I did address it. Sometimes I spoke up about how I felt, that something about my identity was impacting people's perspective or how they were treating me. And sometimes I was successful in that, and sometimes I wasn't. But I don't have been trying to think since you sent me the questions if I have some big or like a specific moment I could share, and I actually haven't been able to think of one. And it doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't one. I have a terrible memory. So again, but I think some of that fortunateness that I spoke to at the beginning relates to this as well. I mean, my identity as white and highly educated and, mostly upper middle class for most of at least my growing up. And then as I was making my way through my early career, I was probably not quite middle class, but, not struggling either. So all of that relates to, not having such a hard time.
Yeah, and I do like how you spoke about discrimination and prejudice of there isn't just this big moment, right? Because even me kind of thinking about how I would answer that question, it does come down to those kind of moments that are a little bit unclear, or there was moments where you advocated for yourself, but there doesn't have to be that standout moment in the workplace. These things kind of happen, as you said, in more of the kind of microaggression kind of way a lot of the time.
Yeah, actually, and what you just said kind of reminded me of something. So coming out of grad school, I did work for a year as a professor, but then after that, I ended up working in LGBT offices on various college campuses. And actually in grad school, I worked in one too. And I have had many experiences where those jobs were part-time, or while I was expected to do the same level of work as people whose title were something like director, I wasn't titled director. So that's partly identity, but it's partly about, whether those identities are valued and whether or not, an organization really wanted to support the LGBT center. So they had it and wanted to, look good and say they had someone doing the work, but then they didn't want to pay me the sort of same amount that they paid others who were doing similar work. And also I've had times where I really felt like they paid me to be there, but then didn't sort of do anything I suggested we do.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Sometimes director positions will be like coordinator, right? But you're still expected to do everything a director does, especially for programs around access, opportunity, around LGBTQ identity, very common.
Yeah, and that was exactly the case. The Gender and Sexuality Resource Center at SUNY Oneonta, I was the coordinator of that space and did all the work and was in all the same meetings as the directors of all the other sort of similar or related programs. So yeah, it was frustrating.
Yeah, and then can you touch a little bit more on, so you have diversity between your experiences. So can you touch on different distinctions you notice, whether it be versus industry, private sector, higher ed, or state to state?
Yeah. There's lots I can say about state to state and about higher ed versus kind of other places. I think technically I haven't really worked in the private sector because it's always either been colleges, nonprofits, or, when I worked for the Washington State Bar Association, that's sort of technically a state agency. It's a little bit oddly situated, but essentially it was a public sector job also. But state to state, I mean, I've lived in a lot of places and experienced the differences in a lot of places. So I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and that's where I also came out. Seattle's a really liberal city. There's sort of this funny stuff in Seattle about we see ourselves as very progressive, and because of that, we are almost blind to our own prejudices, but that's sort of not the point of today's interview. But again, I just, feel like it's important to continue to acknowledge race and class have also played in, I think, and that's part of that sort of Northwest reality. Anyway, so mostly it was a fairly easy time. I mean, high school is not an easy time to come out. There was some minor, again, not hugely serious, but some minor harassment, some name calling and teasing, and not teasing, like mean teasing, not nice teasing. But then I picked a college very, very intentionally that had a hugely LGBT population, or at least very supportive of LGBT identities, and that was Vassar College in upstate New York, in Poughkeepsie, New York. And so Poughkeepsie, you know how it is on college campuses, you're not necessarily really in the town all that much, so there's like that town gown issue. So on campus, I was mostly like super happy, super gay. Everything was great. And there was actually a gay bar in town that we would go to, but also town was not quite as open and accepting. And then following that, I went to grad school in Hawaii, and Hawaii is very interesting because Hawaii has what I call a don't ask, don't tell policy, in terms of there are lots of people who are gay or have a same-sex partner or maybe are transgender, the version of transgender that fits with Hawaiian culture, which we don't have time to sort of go into in depth with that. And as long as you never really directly tried to tell your family about it or talk about it, everything was fine. You could bring your partner to family gatherings and everybody would treat that person great. They would probably call them your friend though. But everybody also kind of knew that they weren't just your friend. But, right, so it was this sort of like, as long as you don't try to make them talk about it or like actively accept it, they would sort of passively accept it, which is an interesting position to be in. Obviously, I wasn't in that position personally, but I had lots of friends who, be able to be out and be themselves and sort of felt like you could half be yourself, but also, not quite get a sense from your family that they 100% accepted you. And then the construction of gender and sexuality in Hawaiian culture, both culture and then what's sort of now the modern Hawaiian culture, which is a mixture of really Hawaiian and a whole lot of other Asian cultures. Both of those have a really different construction of gender and sexual orientation. So it was just a very interesting time. But I did a lot of my LGBTQ work there. That's kind of where I started with the professional version of the LGBTQ work. I was college campus organizing as a student, but I was being paid to work at an LGBT center at University of Hawaii then. So then I went back to New York and then back to Seattle. Now I live in the Seattle area again. So those are the places I've lived. And that's kind of been my experiences. More urban. New York, of course, was more accepting and easier. I spent 6 years at Oneonta, SUNY Oneonta. And that, again, sort of campus usually felt fine. But which now I was living in, right, as an adult and an employee, it was very hard. I felt like I really couldn't find community there. That's some of my experiences there, and I've gone on a little long. So I'll just say I have found that it's very different on college campuses, doing work on college campuses. I mean, it probably helps that I was doing LGBT work. So I skipped San Diego, which was also a really easy place to be. I wasn't there for very long. But doing that LGBT work in those spaces meant it was an organization that was at least somewhat willing to embrace that identity, right? For example, when I worked at the Washington State Bar Association, it was first of all, it was a job that was diversity, equity, and inclusion broadly. And I was a bit more careful about how much I kind of really talked about LGBT issues or like focused on my experience, because there was this pushback sometimes of like, well, you talk too much about sexual orientation, or, what should we really be focused on? Which I think are also microaggressions and a version of, prejudice and oppression. So different spaces lead to different situations. But I have always been in public sector, really. Even now I'm at a nonprofit, Girl Scouts of Western Washington, and it's also pretty easygoing there as well.
Yeah, those distinctions are really important to draw out. I feel like sometimes when you're working on a campus, it's a totally different kind of culture and acceptance atmosphere. And then you step into the town and it's like, oh, okay, differences. And then you also mentioned that I like not looking at a state as this homogenous thing, right? As there's differences when you're upstate versus downstate and urban rural dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
So you touched on this a little bit, but can you talk about your experience regarding disclosing your gender identity, sexuality, and do you have any tips for students based on your experiences?
Yeah, and I realized as I was preparing that I don't quite know if you meant in terms of applying and interviewing, or if you meant once you have the job.
I would say both, if you have time.
Okay. So this is going to partially answer the next question. But yes, I had a lot of LGBT stuff on my resume. That was kind of my big college work. And because I was fortunate that I decided to take a career path that was working in diversity work. And so it wasn't too hard to have that stuff on my resume, and that was completely justified to have argument for why I would be good at diversity work. So it's always been on my resume. It's always been fairly obvious in terms of what people might assume about what that meant about my identity. And so I, in that sense, have been pretty out always with applications. I would say unless there was kind of a reason or a way to talk about it in job interviews, I probably didn't raise it unless they asked, or sometimes they would ask questions that are a little bit more about your personal experiences. I remember applying for a couple LGBT campus center type spaces in other colleges, and I remember one where they asked me if I had any questions about, for them at the end, and I sort of did in that moment ask about, because it was in Idaho. So like, what's the LGBT community like here? How am I gonna feel being here? So I was often pretty out and able to be free with that information, especially around sexual orientation. Again, though, people make an assumption about orientation based on my looks and not so much gender identity. So that always meant, and I actually still feel this thing of feeling like an invisible person around my gender identity, because I'm pretty feminine looking, and I think the gender queer identity gets erased a lot or ignored a lot. I use she or they pronouns, and yet I never ever, very, very rarely hear people use they for me if they're talking about me. And what was the last thing I wanted to say about this? And then once you get to the job, right, like there's a subset of people who've seen your resume, and then a whole bunch that you're working with who haven't necessarily seen it. And so then it's more interesting to try to figure out, how out do you be? How do you come out? Or, and I think as you grow older and just more along work lines, it doesn't feel quite as much like the big coming out, but just like, how do you talk about yourself in your life in ways that are just naturally kind of coming out by doing that, right? By talking about your partner or something along those lines, and using she pronouns, for example, for that person. I had an interesting life, though, where I was partnered to a trans man for a good long percentage of my time. And so then I would actually feel a little invisible with regard to that, because, of course, he was using he pronouns. And so I'd always be like, and luckily he was pretty cool with being a very out trans guy. So I'd be like, by the way, he's trans, right? Kind of keep my own identity feeling strong. If he hadn't been that out, I would have struggled a bit more, I think. Like, we had talked about whether it was okay for me to basically say that. He said yes. So,
yeah, that's good. And I would say this is a kind of a tough follow-up question, a little bit of a hypothetical, but if you were applying to positions that didn't have that diversity and inclusion focus, do you think you would feel comfortable kind of being direct about putting those LGBTQ plus orgs on there?
Yeah. So between between grad school and getting the first job at SUNY Oneonta's Gender and Sexuality Resource Center, I was a professor for 1 year, and I also applied for a bunch of professorships following that. And I will say I don't remember 100% if this is true, but I believe I did leave my LGBT stuff on my resume. And again, I think that was possible sort of because it was still like college campuses I was applying to, and I was applying to ones that I felt like I could be comfortable and happy at. I mean, not only would I never have applied to Liberty University, but if I had, I wouldn't, I don't know. I think I don't even know how to say whether I would have. I would never have applied. So it's hard to even imagine what an application for that kind of organization would look like a more conservative, and Liberty is kind of an extreme example, but even a more conservative institution, I think I would have left it on. For me, what becomes extremely important is that I be accepted at that place. And so and this is really for me, because I think it's different for different people, but for me, I felt like I might as well be, pretty out so that I could be out later. They should know who they're getting, basically. And that also meant in my interviews and stuff, I was pretty bold about the stances I would take or the things I was willing to say. It's a little hard to say if I was applying. I'm trying to think. I mean, I've applied for other kinds of jobs, but I usually leave the LGBT stuff on there because I think that's important, that they know that, they'll assume, but that they kind of would know who they're getting based on those things.
Yeah, and that answer really draws out how dynamic the answer to a question like that is, right? It all depends on where you're at. Are you the kind of person that really wants to be accepted? Or maybe you're in a spot where you don't have that kind of leniency. You really need to get a job. So you might have to make different exceptions. But at the end of the day, I think it's important for kind of everyone to feel accepted in their workplace. So,
right.
And then, so my last question here for you is kind of looking broadly at your experiences. What are ways that new professionals can have a lasting impact on social justice and inclusion that really goes beyond their direct role, or maybe say they plan on staying there a couple of years?
Yeah. So I sort of segued myself well into that with the end of what I said for the last question, which is I think that if you start working for an organization and you really, really like it, and you'd like to stay there or you'd like to improve the organization, to work on being bold and courageous, right? To always be willing to raise the issue around social justice or racism or, whatever it is. So like at Girl Scouts Western Washington, we do have this very interesting dynamic where it's an organization aimed at girls, right? It's Girl Scouts. And yet we also do accept transgender youth. The only group of young people that we're not targeted to or aimed at are cisgender boys. And so we've been really working hard on our language, but we have to help each other and call each other out on it all the time, because it used to be that everything was like girls girls are like this, or our girls are like that, or here's how we support girls, right? But if there's some people in our organization who want to be Girl Scouts but don't call themselves girls, then we're sort of missing them, right? So anyway, point here is just that I love this organization, and yet we all have work to do. And so being willing to raise those things, being willing to talk about them. And, I think you always have to balance a little bit being annoying about it, but I would be persistent about it. And, always be pushing, asking questions, encouraging people to engage or to think deeply about social justice or what the impacts of something might be or what this policy might mean, how it's going to impact people from marginalized communities, et cetera. And I also think it's important to make things as well as the small things, right? So that moment when someone, used it, so I still hear sexual preference every once in a while, and I'll just sort of say, I think the more common term these days is sexual orientation, because preference implies that it's a choice, right? And it's just a quick sentence, and then we go back to whatever the rest of the agenda is of the meeting. And so that's a pretty small one. And then there's big things like, well, if you write that policy that way, you're pretty much discriminating against, right? That's a different kind of big thing versus small thing, right? So I think, trying to do both, and trying to be the voice that is willing to raise those things. Unfortunately, you have to kind of modulate your emotions sometimes with it. So if you want, I think oftentimes it's easy to be frustrated about it, and you're going to have to be willing to kind of set aside your emotions in order to raise it in a way that others can hear it. And that is problematic. And that, again, race plays a role in that because of the tropes and stereotypes about angry people of color, etc. But it's, for now, this, and so I would be also thinking about how do you raise things in ways that others can hear them, or can you ask it as a question instead of a statement that makes people think. I was just talking with my supervisor about how we're actually always playing a game, and it's not to say that it's bad or manipulative, but that while you're at work, you are putting up a certain version of yourself, right? That's not the exact same version that you put up with your friends. And so really recognizing what that kind of advocacy needs to look like in the workplace will help you be more successful in creating change in your workplace.
Yeah, that's really sound advice, and it really gets at that culture, changing the culture of a space, yes. And not so much like, oh, this initiative, this task. You really get at of posing those reflective questions, causing those around you to think, so that it becomes a really collective effort.
Yeah. And I think it is important to volunteer to serve on that diversity, equity, and inclusion committee or whatever, if you have a passion for that. But to not allow the work to get siloed into that committee, because that's kind of one of the things that happens, especially in corporate types, that they're like, yeah, let's start a committee, great. But then the committee gets kind of boxed in, and none of what everybody else who's not in that committee doesn't think it's their work to do DEI work. And the reality is that it really needs to be everybody's work. And so being that voice who kind of reminds us that it's actually everybody's work is also helpful.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much. You have a lot of experience to share, and I think it's going to be very beneficial for our students.
You're very welcome. Again, thanks for asking me. I appreciate it.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you again for taking the time, and to all the students watching, I will see you on the next one.